The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
You're listening to The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows. Hi, I'm Thomas Salerno, and you're listening to The Secrets of the Dark Crystal, where we'll discuss the hidden layers and deeper meanings of Jim Henson's groundbreaking 1982 fantasy film. And joining me today on the panel are Kathryn Laffrey. Hello, Kathryn.
Hello.
And Patrick Mason. Hi, Patrick.
Howdy, Tom.
Be sure to follow The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. You can also subscribe to SQPN on YouTube, where you can click the bell and get notifications whenever a new SQPN podcast goes up. You can also follow the StarQuest Network on social media at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, or on Twitter, where we are at SQPN, or Instagram, where we are at StarQuest Network. Now, before we dive into our discussion of the Dark Crystal, I want to give our viewers a little plot summary that'll help guide us through this. Now, if you have not seen this 40-year-old movie, which a lot of people I talked to have not, and I didn't up until a few years ago, turn back now, because we are going to spoil this entire movie. In the magical world of Thra, the evil reptilian Skeksis have lorded over the power of the Dark Crystal for 1,000 years, desperately trying to prolong their lives, while their wise counterparts, the Mystics, wait for a chosen one to heal the crystal and return balance to the world. That chosen one is Jen, the last of the Gelflings, who was raised by the Mystics from childhood. Jen sets out on a quest to find the missing shard of the crystal. Meanwhile, the Skeksis bicker amongst themselves after the death of their emperor, with the cunning Chamberlain being banished for his presumptions of rule. The other Skeksis fear a prophecy that a Gelfling will destroy them and unleash their crustacean-like Garthim soldiers to capture Jen. In the wilderness, Jen meets a strange hag named Ogra, who tells him that he must return the shard to the Castle of the Crystal before the great conjunction of 3 suns, where the Skeksis will achieve their goal of immortality and rule forever. Escaping from the Garthim, Jen encounters a female Gelfling named Kira and her fuzzy pet Fizzgig. Kira takes Jen to the village of the Podlings, but the Garthim track them down and they barely escape the clutches of the Chamberlain. Jen and Kira infiltrate the castle of the Skeksis, but Kira is captured and Jen is almost killed by falling rocks. Kira is to be drained of her life essence by the Skeksis, but she summons an army of animals, leading to the unintentionally hilarious demise of the Skeksis scientist. Jen and Kira are reunited just as the Great Conjunction begins. Kira is seemingly killed by the Skeksis, and Jen repairs the Dark Crystal using the shard. The Mystics, who have been slowly traveling to the castle on foot, arrive and are merged with their counterparts to become the benevolent spirits called the Urskeks. Before ascending to the stars, the Urskeks revive Kira, telling Jen that the courage and sacrifice of the 2 Gelflings have restored what was once sundered and rejuvenated the world of Thra. Now, that sounds like a complicated plot, but it's actually, there's a lot of unfamiliar names and words, but it's actually a pretty, standard fairy tale. But I think it's all those world building elements, plus Jim Henson's amazing puppetry, that really sets this movie apart in the ranks of fantasy films. And I just want to ask you guys, as we get started, when did you first see the Dark Crystal? When did you first encounter it? And what were your first impressions? Patrick, let's start with you.
You know, my mom tells me I watched it as a kid because we watched it recently with my kids. And my mom happened to be here while we were watching it. And she was like, oh, yeah, you were their age when you saw it. I don't remember it that well. I have somewhat vaguish memories about various aspects of it. Like the Chamberlain stands out in my mind very much.
Yeah.
It's like, yes. Oh my gosh. Oh, it's hard to escape that.
Yeah.
the I guess honestly the noises are what I think I remember the most. The
mystics.
The mystics.
The sound design's amazing in this movie.
Yeah, and the barking of the Rolly dog.
Yeah, Fiskig. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and even the noise the Gartham make. The I don't know. I don't think
kind of chittering noise, sound.
Yeah. That
noise.
Yeah. I remember those. Those are probably the biggest impressions as far as like what I can recall or remember the first time I saw it. And then I didn't see it again till college. And I had a friend who was like, "Oh my gosh, like you don't remember this movie? We got to watch it right now." And we watched it again, and I was like, "Man, this is a weird film."
It certainly is, and it's one of the reasons I love it so much. Just how singular it is. It's fantastic. Kathryn, what about you? What are your memories of this film?
I probably wanted to go see it in the theaters when it was in the theaters, but I have a funny feeling my mom would have been like going, "That seems a little dark." And I was like, "But it's, Jim Henson. I love everything he does." I mean, I used to turn my stuffed animals into Muppets if I could. But I do remember watching it on VHS. We had a neighbor that I used to babysit for all the time who had always the latest, greatest home theater technology. And when I babysat their kids, it was like, okay, what can I watch that I wouldn't be able to see at home? And I think I stumbled across this one, and then The Last Unicorn, and all those great movies from the big revival of fairy tales and fantasies in the 70s and 80s. So I know that, and then of course I finally watched it all the way through yesterday, all by myself. It's like, yes.
Nice.
Did it.
Yeah, check that off.
And this movie was, it's considered one of the quote unquote fantasy flops of the 80s because, it got mixed reviews from critics. And then I don't think audiences knew what to do with it because they're like, "Oh, Jim Henson Muppets." And then you see this, and it's something so completely different from that.
Yeah. But still using this, you're like, "This isn't the Muppets, is it? This is a little different."
No Big Bird, no Snuffleupagus.
No Kermit, but I love that he went out in a completely different direction from what he was used to, and just did this crazy idea that he had. Like, I first really heard about this movie when I read a biography of Jim Henson, which I think is just called Jim Henson. And they talked about the making of this movie. And I'm like, well, that sounds really interesting. I'd really like to see that. But I didn't end up seeing it until a few years ago. I remember it was my birthday. We went out and I bought a bunch of Blu-rays. And the Dark Crystal, I think it was on sale, and I picked it up, the 4K Blu-ray, even though I don't have a 4K TV, but it had the normal Blu-ray with it. So I'm like, and it was one of those cool things that came with extras, like a little booklet and stuff. So I picked that up, and my brother and I watched it, and we just had a blast the whole way through. And we turned to each other after it was over, and we're like, how have we missed this movie all these years? Because we loved every second of it. And I'm just like, it quickly became one of my favorite fantasy movies for reasons I don't think I can properly articulate. It just hits the right buttons for me, I guess. And of course, then we ended up watching the Netflix show, which I might talk a little bit about later, which was really great. But it was canceled, which is terrible. But, but
that's Netflix for you.
That's Netflix for you. I think I might have left Netflix after I heard that they canceled what was one of my favorite shows at the time. But and it's amazing that as we record this, the 40th anniversary of this movie is approaching. And even though it's 40 years old, and there are some there are some special effects shots in the movie which didn't age particularly well, but a lot of it holds up. You know, I just watched the movie again yesterday and I'm like, this movie is stunning visually, and it just draws you into that whole world, which is, I think, if that world, that the world of Thra, which they actually don't mention that name on screen, but I think if you look on the Wikipedia page, it mentions it. But
interesting to see how the name changed. Did anybody else see that?
Oh, did it really?
No.
Yeah.
What was it originally?
It was, I think it was Mithra, but then they changed it to Nira, and then they just changed it to Thra.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was like something to do with like the name being too close to the name of, I think, a Greek god or something like that they ended up changing it because they didn't want it to be associated.
In some of the extended Dark Crystal lore, I think, because I have actually a bunch of like the lore books surrounding this movie and the tie-in novels. I think they bring that name Mithra back and they explain how it changed into Thra. I don't know the exact details, but that's the thing. This world is so intricate. It's like the world of Middle Earth. It's like the world of Star Wars. It's a world that I can get lost in. You know, I just love everything about this world. I mean, Patrick, you mentioned the sounds. You know, the sound design, the visuals. It's a living world. What do you guys think about that aspect of the movie?
I totally agree. I think one of the best things about this movie is the fact that you get lost in it, which is, I think, the reason the visual effects stand up so well is because, like, you know, they're puppets. Like, you know it. Like, looking at them, like my daughter was like, he looks like a Barbie doll, like some of the times, you know, talking about Jen, and it was like, yeah, kind of, you know, the first couple scenes with them just sort of sitting there with the pool and everything. But the further you get into the movie, is moving around, you sort of just start believing all of the motions of the creatures and the more of the world you're introduced to. And it's not just because the first kind of landscapes you encounter around the castle, which is this desolate desert. And then where the mystics live, which is also a different kind of desolate desert. But then in the middle of it, you encounter where the podlings live. And it's this vibrant, thriving swamp jungle thing that's got its own microcosm and biology and stuff eating each other and things are happening.
Yeah, that's great.
This is a world. Like I'm in it now. And so like even the stuff where you with the scientists latching in the podlings or when he's latching in what's her name, the Kira, it looks a little puppety when he's doing that, but even then you're like, yeah, whatever, you know, I'll push the believe button because everything else is just so good, and all it's just so well done. The puppetry is so well done that you just believe it. And these are not puppets talking. These are Skeksis and Gelflings and Grothram, well, they don't talk, and then the craziness of Mother Ogra. It's just nuts.
You could tell kind of, because this movie came out after Empire Strikes Back, and it's co-directed by Frank Oz, who puppeteered and provided the voice for Yoda. But you can tell there's a little bit of Yoda in Mother Ogra.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Oh, even the way she would like giggle and run. So Yoda-ish. It was like Yoda's ugly girlfriend. I don't know.
I can see that.
I want to watch it again just to watch the background. Just, you know, there's so many movies I go to and I watch, and then it's like, oh, I got to watch it again just so I can watch everything else besides the characters, because there were so many little things happening in the background. It was beautiful that way, you know, like you said,
Star Wars
bugs.
a lot.
Yeah,
there's like you said, there's a little microbiome of insects and birds and whatnot that are just flying in the background. And as like a nature and science geek, I love that. I'm like, this is a whole ecosystem that they've built from the ground up in this movie, and I just love it. Yeah,
the concept designer, oh my gosh, what an incredible job he did. And that was the amazing thing, is I got to see his sketches.
Yeah. So Kathryn, you got to see some of the original props from this movie and some of the other stuff at an exhibit. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so it was actually I saw the advertising for the Jim Henson exhibit at the Grand Rapids Art Museum before you even posted wanting to do this podcast. And when I saw the podcast, I was like, oh, now I'm going for sure. I mean, I love Jim Henson's work since I could remember. So going to see those puppets in person was amazing, even some of his really old ones. But then to go around the corner and see these puppets for this movie standing by themselves, and it was just like, as you look at some of them, you think, oh wow, I thought it was bigger than that, and others you're like, oh my gosh, it's that big. Like the hand tools that they had, just a whole case of the hand tools that they made for the characters in the movie, and you're like, oh my gosh, they're big enough that like a human could use these things. So how big was the puppet? And yeah, I mean, I would have, I wish all the puppets were there, but what's her name? Agra?
Yeah, Mother Agra.
That face in person, that close. It was so bad. My daughter thankfully went with me. She didn't want to, but she went with me. And I went to take a picture of the face, and she's like, Mom, please don't. That thing's going to hex you.
Well, she is like a witch, I guess, or a hag, but
yeah. No,
she's
when you called her a hag, I was just like, yeah, that is spot on. Like she's just this crazy.
Well, when she
like,
pops her eye out, it's like the Fates in Hercules,
Oh, right. Yeah, it is. I wonder if they got that.
And the first time your
idea.
eyeball's just sitting there, it looked so real. It was like, oh, that's so weird. It's like wet and everything.
Yeah.
That's the first thing you see, right? Is her eyeball. Like you don't see her because Jen gets caught up in the vines and he's just sitting there and her eyeball comes up and you're like, oh,
what? Yeah.
Okay.
Or when she leaves it on the table when she's caged up with the scientist, it's like, oh, no.
Put it back in, blow it off a couple times, put it back in the eye socket.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And that's the great thing. Like there's just little moments in this film that if you've seen the film, you're going to remember them. There's so many great little standout moments. One of my favorites is just that whole sequence when they go to Kira's village, and I'm like, podlings know how to live. I'm like, I want to live with these people. They just know how to have a good time. And I love how like Jen, he's just trying to learn to say thank you. And I think he's not saying it right, because the way some of them like react to him trying to say thank you in the podling language, it's almost like he said something wrong or insulted them. And I'm like, I just the puppets are so expressive. Even the Gelflings, which are not as expressive as they could be. Like, I think that they're some of like, the stiffest with their facial expressions. They're still, like you said, Pat, you believe them. You believe these characters once you've spent an hour and a half with them. And that's another thing. This movie has not a single human character in it. And that's one of the other things I think makes it groundbreaking as a fantasy movie. Because even other fantasy movies of the period, like Willow or Labyrinth or The Neverending Story, they have humans in them. This, no humans. And yet we can identify with these characters. And that's an interesting question I didn't even think of before recording. What would you say is your guys' favorite character out of all the characters in the movie?
Picking one? That's hard.
I know, right?
I think, well, before we get to that, the whole no humans thing. So I hit my children with that before we turned the movie on. I was like, there's not going to be any people in this. And they're like, what? What are you talking about? There's no people in this. It's not animated. No, it's not animated. It's puppets. I was like, okay. And then when we got to the podling scene, they were like, oh, they're the people. They're the humans in this world. And I'm like, yeah, they probably are. Like, that's that's pretty human what they're doing there.
Yeah, they seem to be like the average kind of Joe in this fantasy world. You know, they're the only ones who don't seem to have any sort of magic about them. Even the Gelflings can do that thing where they read each other's thoughts, but the Podlings are just these little potato people.
They seem like hobbits meet Fraggle Rock.
Yeah, hobbits meet Fraggle Rock meet Ewoks.
Yeah,
and it's
Oh, yeah.
and like I said, like which is like, and once you see them being enslaved by the Skeksis, you're just like, no, leave them alone.
That's just mean. It's not. I mean, it's evil. Don't get me wrong, but it's also just mean. Come on.
Yeah.
Come on.
It's like these little people who've never done any harm to anybody. They just want to hang out in their village and have fun. And it's just like, pull this giant rock, you slaves. And I'm like, oh. But yeah, so yeah, if you had to pick a character in this movie.
Fizzgig.
Fizzgig, good choice.
Oh, yeah. I want one of those just rolling around the house with that huge mouth, the double jaw line.
Double jaws, yeah.
He looks so cute. And he opens his mouth. You're like, oh my gosh, what could that thing eat? Goodbye shoes.
That was one of my kids' favorite parts was when he was like, they were like, okay, you got to stay here. And he was like, no, he's just, yeah. The kids just, they hit the ground laughing.
He throws a tantrum. Mm-hmm. It's so great. Like,
right. And you think about like the simplicity of that puppet, right? It's literally almost literally a sock puppet that can roll.
Yeah.
And yet so expressive. Like you get so much out of Fizzgig. For me, it's hard not to pick one of the Skeksis just because of how characterized they are. I mean, it's tough not to go with like Jin or Kira because just, they're the hero and heroine of the story and it's mostly about them. But man, the Chamberlain is just an interesting guy, especially when you get into the TV show.
Yeah.
You get to know the Skeksis a whole lot better. So yeah, I'd probably go with the Chamberlain just because we spend the most time with him.
Yeah, and I'm kind of influenced by the television show too, and Mark Hamill's portrayal of the scientist in that.
Oh yeah,
he's not the scientist in this movie, but he is in the television show, and he does a really great job. And just like I love how eccentric the scientist is, and his demise is one of my favorite moments in the movie. Because both my brother and I guessed it. As soon as the animals start breaking out of their cages, we're like, okay, fall into that pit behind you. Fall into that pit. And of course the animals like push him off into the pit and we're like, yes! So the fact that we kind of saw it coming made it even funnier. But yeah, I
actually saw the ending thanks to Chamberlain. When I first started watching and they stripped Chamberlain of his robes.
Oh, yeah.
He walks by and you see his crumpled up second pair of arms. And I went, knew it. I could tell just by the shape of their faces and the shape of the Mystics' faces. I'm like, oh, these guys are one and the same.
Yeah, those parallels are from the beginning of the movie. Their narration parallels, so the narration kind of clues you in that these are the same people. They say that they both appeared at the same time. The fact that both the Skeksis Emperor and the leader of the Mystics both die at the same time.
Yeah.
And you just start to think like, okay, are these two halves of the same coin here? And that kind of leads into something interesting because like I feel like a lot of the sort of deeper layers and philosophical ideas in this movie revolve around the Skeksis and the Mystics. Because there's a lot of heavy, dualism in this movie where it's like good and evil need to be reintegrated in order for healing to take place, which isn't exactly a very, Christian idea. In our worldview, evil is a privation of the good. It's not a thing in itself. But yeah, what do you guys think of these, of how they handle the kind of ideas about good and evil in this movie? Because the Skeksis, it's not like they portray it as good and evil aren't different. The Skeksis are pretty evil.
It was interesting because the first thing it made me think about was something that I read in John Smerick's Seven Deadly Sins.
I thought of the Seven Deadly Sins too.
But he talks about that balance. So you have vice on one side and you have neurosis on the other side, and virtue is the perfect balance in between.
Oh.
And so I kind of saw it more like that, where it's like maybe the mystics were more like to neurosis side, and, bringing them together was when virtue happened. But there was one other interesting thing. I don't know if this trivia is true or not, but supposedly when Henson pitched this to the concept designer, is it Frad or Fraud or...
Oh, yeah. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. When he pitched it to the designer misunderstood him when he said chrysalis and thought it was crystal. And so it was supposed to be the dark chrysalis, like a...
Oh, like what a moth comes out of.
Yeah. So then it made me think, wait, when you listen to the movie again, thinking about that, it's like it cracked. And then these two things happened. It almost feels like they're two larvae that need to come back together. And I'm like, okay, that makes more sense to me, seeing that the final result, what are they, Urskeks or whatever
the Urskeks, yeah.
Yeah, to see how different they look from the other two.
Right.
It's like a butterfly and an ugly caterpillar. There's such a big difference. And it's like, even seeing them all like glowing and their hands up with their big robes, it was like, it almost seemed like that, caterpillar to the butterfly moment.
That's really interesting. I'd like to look into that because, wow, yeah, that just adds an even more interesting wrinkle.
Yeah, it's related to so there's this concept in 12-step ministry called the beam, right? And it's sort of like you walk along the beam, and I always used to like pride. So on one side of the beam is pride, like you can fall off the beam, it's like a balance beam, and fall into pride. And on the other side is false humility, and you can fall off the beam into false humility. But on the beam is actual humility, right? And when you look at a lot of life in general, it's very much a tightrope walk between these two, extremes. There's a lot of talk these days, because the Eastern religions are interesting to a lot of people about like the middle way that comes from Buddhism. But that whole concept of avoiding the extremes has been a long-standing thread in Catholic, not so much theology, but spirituality. Avoiding, both sides of the ball, to stay in the middle, stay on target, right? To
stay on target, yeah.
Stay on target to bring it back. And so for me, what the Skeksis sort of, they're prideful, but they're also able to lead. They're like, strong, they're purposeful, but they're obviously vain, and they're gluttonous at the same time. And on the other side of the ball, you have like the mystics who are, they don't need a lot. They have their kind of routine, and they're all working as a community. You don't see the infighting like you have with the Skeksis, but at the same time, they're not taking care of anything. They're slothful. They're not, really doing their job, more or less, is kind of, as these powerful beings in this realm, the Skeksis and they've sort of let the Skeksis run wild. And so you have these two things that aren't doing their jobs, right? And it sort of, the movie sets it up as you go through to, okay, these are two sides of a coin, but we're not seeing the coin. The coin looks way better on edge. I guess,
right, yeah.
when it's a fully merged coin. And it's interesting to me conceptually how the Skeksis seem to deal with the loss of their own versus how the Mystics do. And that comes a little bit from the show too, but you see like the death of the Emperor is like a huge thing. It sends the Skeksis into turmoil, and there's a crisis of leadership and the, trial by stone. And on the other hand, like, the leader of the Mystics dies, and they have a little ceremony, and then they're done. They go back to their thing, right?
or later when one of them just bursts into flame and the others just kind of look like, huh? And then just keep walking.
Oh, well, yeah, it's like whatever.
He just disappears.
Yeah, it's and it's not like because the leader of the Mystics, he sort of like turns into stars and everything, but the other one like legit bursts into flames, like whoosh, and you're like, yeah, whatever, it's okay. So yeah, there's the dualism, I think, is a good way to put it, but it's sort of like you had too far on one end and too far on the other.
Right. The Mystics have their flaws, even though they're on the side of good. Like you said, they've kind of let the world go to rot, which is interesting because, and we get, again, some of this in the TV show, but you can see it in the movie how the crystal cracking, that event that creates both the Skeksis and the Mystics, also somehow makes the world off kilter or poisons the world somehow. To me, it's almost like the classical, like, patristic interpretation of original sin, that it's not just affecting humans, it's affecting the cosmos in a way. And in the show, this effect is called the darkening, but they don't name it in the movie. But you can see how like some areas of the land, especially around the Skeksis castle, are just blasted desert. They're completely messed up. And by the end of the movie, when the crystal is restored, which and funny, it's called the Crystal of Truth. I wonder what that's about. But when the crystal is restored and the Skeksis and Mystics are made whole again, the land is all of a sudden rejuvenated. And like immediately. So I think there's something interesting there to be said about kind of original sin and kind of the poisoning effect of evil. Because as humans, when we make sinful choices, it doesn't just affect us on an individual level. It affects all the other people around us and like even the planet when, we decide not to steward it as we should.
It was interesting to see in the middle ground with the podlings how there was life, there was some beauty, there was green. And yet, you go to either spectrum with the other guys and it's just, so you kind of see how it's like there's that little bit of what should have been still existing, that remnant. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's interesting too.
Yeah, I thought, and I think it plays out in and obviously we don't get enough time because it's an hour and a half, but in the characters of Jen and Kira, just how they interact with the world. You have Jen, who is raised by the Mystics and who lives sort of an austere, out of place existence, and then he goes out into the world finally, and he is just bewildered. He is like, what am I doing here? What is all of this stuff? What is that thing over there? What just did that? He gets scared out of his wits by Fizgit and then falls into that water thing, and then that turns out he's on top of another giant monster that comes out of the water.
That was great.
But on the other hand, Kira, who's been living with the Podlings, who are this pretty rough and ready group of folks, seems to be in commune with the whole thing, with all of nature. And you would think that Jen, being with the Mystics, right, being in this, group, and doing their things, would be the guy who was in commune with nature. But it turns out it's Kira who's been living in it and been living. And I thought that was it was a very interesting juxtaposition of their characters and of sort of like, where you grow up affecting how you interact with the world around you, and what it means to you. And even, I mean, I think we see that a lot today with people who, you know, maybe think they're very, very spiritual folks, and then they get into an actual spiritual situation and they're like, oh, I'm out of my depth here. Like, I don't understand.
Right, yeah. I mean, Jen is sheltered. He's lived in the Valley of the Mystics his whole life. And like you said, Kira's been living, you know, and she's almost kind of, I don't want to say unfallen, but she's more, like you said, in commune with nature. She has that, you know, way of looking at the world around her and appreciating things that where, like you said, Jen is just terrified of everything.
It's interesting too, because she understands the oral tradition. So she understood that, you know, them holding their hands would be like this dreamlike communication. And she understood when they went into the ruins what was there, but she couldn't read the writing. Where Jen had been taught by the mystics could read the writing. And I love that little line between the two of them where she's like, what's writing? And he's like, words that don't go away or whatever it was. It was just like, words that stay. That was it. Stay. I love that. Words that stay. So it was interesting just to see that dynamic between the two of them where he's like written history and she's like verbal history. And so when the two of them come together, you're getting that complete story. So, and it was one thing I picked up after looking at the photos again of the actual puppets. On the front of Kira's garment, she has that 3-leafed image that was on the throne in the ruins that she sat down at. So it's kind of cool because it's like she's definitely more connected to the past than he is.
And like he doesn't even know the basic biology of his species, you know, when it's revealed that Kira has wings and can fly, and he's like, I don't have wings, and she's like, of course not, you're a boy. And like, you know,
you're like, wait a minute.
But to her that's just like obvious. Well, of course you don't have wings, you're a boy. But to him, it's just like, why did the mystics not tell me this stuff?
Yeah, it's the head mystic's line. He's like, I should have told you this stuff earlier. And the further you get in the movie, you're like, yeah, you really should have. He is clueless about all this stuff. Yeah.
I mean, it's been only 1,000 years. You couldn't get the whole story in.
Right, yeah. One line which I was surprised they did not use in the promotional material for the television show was the leader of the Mystics says to Jen, because he's like, well, what do you know of the Skeksis? And Jen's just like, well, they killed my parents. And the Mystic leader is like, the story runs deeper than you know, and you were a part of it. And I was like, why did not they use that line as promotion for the show? Because that's the great thing about the TV show is that it starts to give you that even deeper story of this world and like its past and how it got to this point that the Skeksis are in complete control. And
where does that TV show start? I've never seen it, so I don't know. Where did like what timeline? Where does that fit in the timeline? The TV show.
It's sort of like
it's
several, it seems like possibly hundreds of years, but maybe not that long. It's hard to place, but it's before they started draining creatures for their essence. Before that, the Skeksis seem to have been doing okay, and then one of the big, you know, movements on their plot line through the show is the fact that they're actually starting to fall apart due to the darkening, more or less, and they have to find a way to forestall it, and that starts the whole essence draining thing. But in the opening shot of the show, like the castle grounds are still green, like that whole area around the castle is still a verdant green. There's, you know, rivers running, everything's good. There's whole clans and civilizations of Gelflings, so it seems pretty far off.
But the dark crystal's already there.
Yes.
Because my question is, where the heck did the dark crystal come from? Because at the end, they all flew off. So it's like, did they bring it here? I mean, is it like their little alien pod?
I want to say, it talks in the opening sequence of the show. It talks a lot about Mother Ogra and the crystal. Like they're sort of like they were there at the beginning. It's sort of like Tom Bombadil. Yes. He's just always been there.
Yeah.
And
Ogra is kind of a like, Mother Earth figure.
Yeah, very much so. And they talk about the Urskeks coming, or maybe at that point they were the Skeks, but that's a little fuzzier. But they come to Thra, and they sort of tie up Mother Ogra with her big orbital thing for like 1,000 years. And that during that, when she's not paying attention effectively, is when they break the crystal and they split. And so she kind of like wakes up to this, things were not like this when I was asleep kind of a deal.
Yeah, and the Skeksis are interesting because they kind of in themselves are an effective metaphor, visual metaphor for sin. It's like what sin does to you on the inside is them on the outside, because they're hideous and they don't try to hide what they do. Like you said, Pat, they're gluttonous, they're envious, they're vain. You know, if all of the 7 deadly sins, like they've done them, you know, there's nothing they haven't done seemingly. So I feel I really think that they're a kind of effective visual metaphor. They're not like other fantasy villains, like Sauron from the Lord of the Rings, you know, like they're a different kind of evil. They're a slimy, unsettling kind of evil.
Yeah, like Tolkien always talked about well, not always, but later in his life, he talked about the orcs and the goblins were kind of a cheat because they didn't have a past. They didn't have a society or a culture or anything. They were bad guys. They were evil. And he was like, I did it because it was easy. And because it made for good stories and good storytelling. And Sauron is, evil. And we get the story kind of behind Melkor and all that through the Silmarillion. But with the Skeksi, they're not just evil necessarily. Like they display it. It's on like full blown, like, and they're just, I mean, even if a Skeksi was like acting nice, which the Chamberlain does on several occasions, he's still terrifying. Like, I don't want to deal with this giant vulture, bird, lizard monster thing. No, thank you. Like, I just, whoa. and so, I think it's very interesting. Like, even if they were to try to be good, which they kind of are-ish in the show, at least to some extent.
Oh, and then there's the heretic who's trying to act good.
Right, yeah. Oh, yeah, I totally forgot about him.
The Skeksis heretic, yeah.
Yeah.
He's living with his mystic, and they're trying to act in concert, but their personalities are so different that they still, they still can't completely get along. But I thought that was interesting. That's a great thing about this universe. There's so much potential to expand and tell new stories. And that's what made the show great. What was not great, though, are some of the tie-in comic books, because there was going to be a sequel to this movie. And it was going to be called The Power of the Dark Crystal. But it didn't end up being made. And instead, that screenplay was turned into a series of comic books, which are terrible. Do not read them. The comic, like, people blame the Star Wars sequels for undermining the original movies. They have nothing on The Power of the Dark Crystal, which completely upends everything Jen and Kira fought for, undermines them as characters, just to put on a pedestal these new characters. Here's your new heroes, like them. And I'm just like, nope. No. The great thing about this movie is just, how much like a traditional fairy tale it is, just with no humans in it, and you have Jen and Kira, who are almost all the characters are archetypes. are kind of fairy tale archetypes. Henson is clearly working with the monomyth here. And it's that kind of, I think, almost primeval sort of storytelling, like with Star Wars, is what I think really makes this film work.
Yeah, and I like that Jim Henson actually said that he wanted this to be like a Grimm fairy tale. He wanted it to show the darkest dark, to let kids know, don't go there. Don't touch this. There's something bad there. But I love the fact that I watched this realizing when it was made and then thought about all of the movies after it that almost picked up different elements of it.
Yeah.
Like, to me, when they showed the Skeksis like rejuvenating a little bit, first thing I thought of was a Star Trek movie.
Oh, which
Do you
one?
remember the Next Generation one where you have the children that left the planet that lived forever?
Yeah.
And they're always trying to like fix their faces and, rejuvenate, only to find out that, no, you have to go back. You have to be back where you were, that merging back together. Or at the very end when you have, they're all, the crystal's doing its thing, it's lighting up. They tell you that it's leaving you with truth or knowledge in a way, and you're right away. And watching them fly off was like the crystal skull.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, these are like the crystal skull aliens.
Yeah, they really were.
Yeah. Or even having Jen go, oh, I wish this didn't come to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's Frodo.
Oh, right. Yeah. Except Jen tries to throw it away, whereas, Frodo would not have done that. Yeah.
No.
It would have been a completely different movie if, like, the shard had some sort of evil influence on you that once you had it, you, like, became obsessed with it.
Yeah.
I think, talking about the monomyth or the Grimm's fairy tales, it very much reminded me of Grimm's fairy tales. But it also reminded me of like the precursor fairy tales to those. Because there was actually something of a shift with Grimm's and the moving the fairy tales into these morality tales, which was, had their own goods in a way, but they were different from a lot of the old fairy tales, which were not so much morality tales as just stuff happens. And sometimes stuff happens, bad stuff happens to good people, and sometimes good stuff happens to bad people, and just stuff happens. And this, I thought, was actually a pretty good portrayal of like both. You had sort of the big overarching good, evil, recombining of the mystics and the Skeksis and the overarching plot. But then you also had like the podlings who were just living their lives, and then all of a sudden the Gartham come in and wreck it all. And honestly, both Jin and Kira just sort of living their lives and going on about their business, and all of a sudden they're on this massive quest to heal the crystal and put everything right. And I thought it was actually a really good blend of both those kind of fairy tales. I thought they did a really good job. The more I think about it, a fantastic job of kind of blending both of those themes together. That there is a constant struggle between good and evil, and the evil you do can have long-lasting and wide-ranging effects, and it can affect people who aren't even involved, but the effect on them suddenly makes them involved, and because of that, sometimes they've got to fix the problems that you make. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jim Henson himself was a student of fairy tales. He loved collecting folklore and myths and fairy tales from around the world. And you can definitely see he's like George Lucas did with Star Wars. He's taken a lot of that and he's kind of distilled it into this story that hits a lot of familiar beats, but does it in new and interesting ways. And in a world that just feels at the same time really familiar and at the same time radically different and exotic. And I just think it's one of those movies that I guess when it came out, maybe audiences weren't ready for it, or maybe it was just too different from his previous stuff. But I really think it's a triumph of fantasy storytelling and of cinema, not just of like and of visual effects. Just the advances in puppetry that happened with this movie were pretty astounding. And I think it really of the movies of that era that were fantasy movies, I think this one kind of, for me at least, stands head and shoulders above the others.
Yeah. It was interesting. I almost wondered if it would have done better if it didn't have to compete with E.T. that came out shortly after it.
Oh, yeah. Well, E.T. kind of swept everybody away.
Yeah.
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 Good old Spielberg.
Right, yeah.
I guess this played well, though, overseas in some countries.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Not in the Middle East, though, where I heard it was like censored, burned.
Oh.
Not allowed to be shown. I guess, it was said it was sacrilegious and which is interesting.
Another interesting tidbit is that apparently Henson had thought of doing the movie with no English dialogue, not even subtitles. And he showed some of the suits that dinner scene of the Skeksis all eating all the creatures and just burping and doing all kinds of gross stuff with no dialogue. And they were like, Jim, what is this? And so like the people are
watching here.
Yeah. So like, the people around him kind of reined him in, and they're like, we need dialogue in this movie. This can't be just a visual like experiment. There needs to be something to connect with the audience. But yeah, to have been a fly on the wall at that moment would have been very interesting.
Yeah, can you imagine watching the whole thing with Chamberlain just going,
Oh my gosh. Oh. Yeah, they've been rough. They've been really rough. If I could leap through the screen and punch that guy, I would.
Right, yeah. Again, especially with the TV show, when you learn more about him and you're like, this guy is one of the slimiest, most conniving people.
Did he have some magical power with his please?
Oh,
Do you notice the way Jen just kind of seemed mesmerized for a second there? It's like, when Kira had to break him out of the spell almost, and it was like, oh, what's going on there?
Yeah, in the show, he uses that on several occasions. But in the show, up until the end, like the Skeksis are considered trusted rulers.
Right.
So like the Gelflings are just like naturally inclined to just go along with whatever the Skeksis say or do. But yeah, now that I think about it, I do feel like there is something there to that.
That's interesting. That makes the ruins on the wall make more sense.
Right.
Because I stopped and looked at that, and to see they had the Gelflings bringing things in, the Skeksi bringing things in. They had the final Uraskek or whatever they're called.
Yeah.
We're all standing around the crystal. So it kind of was like, oh, wait, that's actually what they're supposed to eventually look like. And it was interesting just to see that on the wall after what you just said. It's like, okay, I could see now why there was a little more cooperation there.
Yeah. And the ruins are a village, if I remember right, in the show.
I think it's Stone in the Wood. Yeah,
I think it is Stone in the Wood.
Yeah, and that made me really sad watching the movie again.
Yeah,
I was like, I know this place. I've seen. Yeah. I'm like, oh, and I'm pretty sure like Kira is sitting on like the throne of the Maudra. Yes. The matriarchal leader of their village, which I thought was neat.
Yeah.
Is Kira a descendant?
I think she might be. It's so frustrating that show was canceled because, I had a lot of theories about who people were supposed to be the maybe ancestors of or where things were going to lead. And to see the story incomplete is very frustrating.
Yeah, we never got to see the love triangle get resolved. Like,
that.
Yeah. And like, I remember sitting like halfway through the show and I'm like, I am really invested in this like love triangle or tetrahedron of puppets. They're puppets, Pat.
No. Okay, so before this becomes the secrets of the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance on Netflix, I think I should ask you guys for final thoughts. What would you say to wrap up our discussion of the Dark Crystal?
Oh, I'd have to say Jim Henson is just an incredible genius, and the people that he worked with were amazing. Just going through and looking at scenes from the documentary making of, and I think I probably saw that in its entirety before I actually saw the movie in its entirety. I was always just so amazed at the way they work and how the finished product, how it looks, and how alive the characters became.
Yeah.
It was so impressive to me, and I was such a big fan that I actually in drama class in middle school did not want to be on stage, so helped the teacher rewrite the part of the Wizard of Oz to have a little sidekick, and I grabbed my friend's animal Muppet and played out the sidekick to the Wizard of Oz as animal. And yes, I had so much fun actually going, I can be a puppeteer like Jim Henson. This is so cool.
Awesome. Yeah, I really do love this movie. It's such a zeitgeist, if I'm going to use that word. I don't like that word, but I'm going to use it anyways. It's such a zeitgeist of like puppetry and world building at the same time. It's sort of like, it never seemed to me like puppetry for the sake of puppetry. It seemed to me like this is a way I'm going to tell this story, and it works really, really well for this story. And it's built this amazing world that you get to see sort of, and I think Ogre puts it well, it's an end, it's a beginning, it's a big, big change, right? And you get to see this sort of, and so it leaves you definitely like, well, what came before and what's going to come after? Come on, man. Right. Like, don't leave me hanging. Like the journeys the characters go on, even though they're very short, they're still very impactful. And then the deeper themes, I think they're on display well enough that it's hard not to catch them. And that to me, I think that makes the fantasy movies the best. Like you talk about like, what were the best of those fantasy movies? Because you've got a ton of them that came out in that time. And, this one, Willow, Neverending Story. And then you start, moving down the line to like Kroll and Conan and it's not the Falconer. I can't remember what he is, but and then you go, even further down the line to the ones that like Mystery Science Theater makes fun of. And,
oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think what differentiates them is the kind of the monomyth stuff, the storytelling, and then the deeper meanings and themes being evident enough to the audience that, like, I know we're in a strange world and nothing might make sense, and it's fantastic, and it's all ooh and ah, but it's not just ooh and ah. There's more to it than that, and I think the Dark Crystal does that pretty spectacularly.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you guys have just said, both as a masterclass of puppetry and visual effects, and as a masterclass of fantasy storytelling. Those two things combined make this, one of my favorite fantasy movies of all time. For me, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings are always going to be on the top because I'm such a Tolkien fan. But the Dark Crystal is really up there. And it inspires me as a creative person. I can always go back to the Dark Crystal and feel inspired to just create something, whether it be a piece of writing or a podcast or just anything. I just feel almost like the world of Thra. I feel rejuvenated creatively after watching this movie. So, and I think that's a good note for us to end on. But before we end, we'd like to take a brief moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Ryan Z, Paul E, Kathleen G, Lauren N, and Jonathan H. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give help us to continue to create the secrets of movies and TV shows and all the shows here at StarQuest. You can join them at sqpn.com/give. So now we'd like to hear from you, our viewers and listeners. What are your thoughts on Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal? Did you see it back in the day, or like me, did you only recently discover it? Have you seen Netflix's Age of Resistance television show, and do you hope it makes a comeback? You can let us know by contacting us at sqpn.com/secrets, or on our Facebook page or on Twitter, or you can send an email to secrets@sqpn.com, or you can visit the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord. Once again, Patrick Mason, thank you for joining me and sharing the secrets of the Dark Crystal.
You're very welcome. This was a lot of fun.
And Kathryn Laffrey, thank you as well.
Thank you. This was a fun time.
And I'm Thomas Salerno. Thank you for listening to the secrets of movies and TV shows on StarQuest.
Here's another show on the StarQuest Network you're sure to enjoy. The Secrets of Doctor Who. Find the show wherever fine podcasts are found or at sqpn.com/Doctor Who.